Good afternoon and welcome to the first Crossroads of Ideas for Fall 2020. My name is Laura Heisler and I work with WARF, the Morgridge Institute for Research, and the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And these are the three organizations that come together to produce the Crossroads of Ideas series. The goal of this series is to connect our community with issues that matter to us and happen to be the subject of research at UW-Madison. As we did 4 years ago, we're kicking off this semester with a look at the upcoming presidential election. And before I turn things over to our moderator and our panel of experts, I want to give you a few pointers for how you can participate in this session. We'll be having a facilitated discussion among the panelists for about 40 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity to respond to your questions. You can ask a question of any of the presenters at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you mouse over your screen. The presenters might answer your question directly if it's something very specific, and everyone will then have a chance to see your answer. If it's something that would be really valuable for our discussion, our moderator will tee that up for the whole panel. We'll get to all of your questions as much as we can towards the end of this session, which will run exactly an hour, so we'll finish at the top of the hour. We are recording this session, and you'll be able to find the recording at discovery.wisc.edu in a few days. So with that, I don't want to waste any more time. I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Veronica Rickert from UW Communications. Veronica, the virtual podium is all yours.
Well, thank you, Laura, and it is a pleasure to be here again at this Crossroads of Ideas. Today we are getting ready for the first of 3 presidential debates. This first is coming up Tuesday, September 29th at Case Western University and the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. Fox's Chris Wallace is moderating. And as we dig into that today, we have 6 outstanding panelists with us today, and they'll be walking us through some of the key topics, most of them, in fact, that we'll be hearing from the debate stage on Tuesday. We'll be talking about the economy. We'll be talking about COVID-19, the Supreme Court, race, cities, and more. And we'll also be talking about how a successful debater looks, how they sound, sort of the stagecraft and the optics and the rhetoric that go into a debate, along with what it means to have a discussion from across the bipartisan divide. All of that today. And I'd like to begin by introducing you to our panelists one at a time with a sort of lightning round. And so what I want to know from each of you, and I'll call on you each in turn, alphabetical order, is to have us share one thing that you'll be looking from that debate stage, one key element, one key issue, some message that will be top on your list. And we'll begin first with Kathy Cramer. Kathy is the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science and a professor of political science at UW-Madison. She's most recently the author of The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness, and The Rise of Scott Walker. Kathy, welcome. And what is one key thing you'll be listening for on Tuesday?
Thank you so much. I'm going to be really interested in what they have to say about election integrity. I know that's one of the 6 topics on the docket, and I'm going to be listening for what each of the candidates tell us we have to fear about the upcoming election, because I think that will have something to do with how their supporters get mobilized or activated around whether they vote absentee or show up in person. And that's something that I care a lot about. I co-chair our Badgers Vote Coalition for our campus. And so I'm very concerned about people participating in this election.
Kathy, thank you. And we'll go next to Stephen Deller. Stephen is a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics and a community development economist with the Division of Extension. His work focuses on trying to help communities better understand changes to the economy and policy options. Stephen, what are you going to be listening for on Tuesday?
Good afternoon. I think it's going to be the civility between the 2 candidates and whether or not they can actually engage in a conversation, or does it actually deteriorate into, I don't think it would be name calling, but does it become very uncivil and somewhat unseemly? So I'm going to be looking for kind of the civility between the candidates.
Civility, thank you for that. And let's move now to Linda Greene. Linda Greene is the EVU Bascom Professor of Law. She's co-founder of the Black Women in Sport Foundation and an expert on the confirmation of federal judges and the topic of race and police use of deadly force. Linda, thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to hear from you. What is something you'll be listening for on Tuesday? I think your mute button may be on, Linda. Yep. Good old technology.
Students have advised me all the way. They're not here to hold my hand right now. Yes, I'll be listening. Obviously to all the topics, which are extremely important, but especially to two topics. One, the Supreme Court, very much top of mind with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and also with the president's promise to make that nomination on Saturday. I think that's going to be right at the top. And then in addition, I think that both candidates will need to speak to the concern that both Blacks and whites in this country have about racialized use of police deadly force, especially with the recent decision by the grand jury in Kentucky involving the death of Breonna Taylor. I think that this will be an extremely important topic, and it'll be interesting, and you may tease it out of us later. It will be interesting to see how we expect the two candidates to address those topics differently.
Great, thank you so much for that. And we move next to Dr. Baron Kelly, professor in the Department of Theater and Drama. He's traveled extensively as a cultural specialist for the United States Bureau of Education, teaching and lecturing on the theater in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And he's taken part in many national and international cultural debates centered around transnational Blackness and the question of representation. And Baron, tell us, what do you think you'll be listening for?
Empathy toward racial justice and a reciprocal exchange of impulses, from the theater, and authenticity and directness. That's what I'm going to be looking for.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that. And we'll dive into that deeper as we go along. We move now to Allison Prasch, Assistant Professor of Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture in the Department of Communication Arts. Her research focuses on U.S. presidential rhetoric and foreign policy. Allison, thanks for being here. And if you could tell us what you'll be thinking about come Tuesday.
Yeah, so I'll be thinking about two specific things. The first is how both candidates articulate their specific policies for how they will address the multiple crises that we're facing right now in this country. I'm thinking about a global pandemic, the economy, racial justice, police brutality, and many other things. And then second, and relatedly, I'll be looking to see how they articulate who they see the American people to be and who they call us to be through their speech, because there are, you could argue there are two differing perspectives right now, and how they articulate it, I think, is going to be really important for the voters to hear.
Terrific, thank you. And last but not least, Ajay Sethi is with us, Associate Professor of Population Health Sciences and Faculty Director of the Master of Public Health program. He's an infectious disease epidemiologist and teaches the popular course, Conspiracies in Public Health. Hello, Ajay, and what's on your mind? What are you thinking about for Tuesday?
Well, I'm curious how each of the candidates, articulate their perceived threat of COVID-19 and sort of what they think about the response so far and what's the plan moving forward.
That is a great place to leave it. Thank you all for your thoughtful and insightful answers, and we'll dig into that. But I do want to start with, I think it's hard to pick one extraordinary story from this year because there have been many, but the fact that we seem to be in what could be a once in a century pandemic is certainly at the top of the list for many of us. And so Ajay, let's begin with you. We are in an extraordinary moment. What do you think the American public wants to hear from their leaders on the debate stage as they think about who the next president of the United States will be in terms of where we are right now in this pandemic, public health-wise, and where we need to go to get through it? What are you thinking about that topic?
That's a tough question, just because the topic of the pandemic, it varies from person to person. And, there's data to show that among likely voters, the pandemic is a top concern for Biden supporters and not a top concern for Trump supporters. For Trump supporters, the economy is, a higher concern there. So in a sense, I think voters are going to want to hear what confirms their established beliefs about the state of the pandemic in the US. And I think each candidate probably will do a reasonable good job about articulating what they think is going on with COVID-19. But I think everybody does want to get past this pandemic. And I think there's just a different maybe approach as to how to go about doing that, with some voters probably feeling that our response has not been strong enough, so we've got to get stronger, particularly heading into the winter, while others might dismiss the severity of the pandemic and feel like we should run its course. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what each candidate says.
And I'd love to hear from you, an expert in public health, where you think we are. Obviously, this is an issue that has become very politicized, and people, as you were saying, see this from different perspectives, sometimes based on which political party they affiliate with. But if we can look at this from a bipartisan perspective, where are we? How are we doing in terms of fighting the pandemic? And as you said, getting through it, which is the goal.
I mean, we've just passed 200,000 deaths among Americans so far in 2020 due to COVID. So COVID is going to be likely the #3 leading cause of death in the United States by the end of the year. And projections show that it could be as high as 400,000 at the end of the year. It may be less, but really we've already gone to the point where the number of deaths is unacceptable. And so I would say that we're in a very difficult spot, and a lot of it was avoidable if we had a more robust national response. As everybody knows, the states were sort of left up to themselves how to best to respond, and there was a lot of variation in how they responded. So we're sort of in a tough position now. I think it really, we'll see how people feel about where we are now and how to move forward. Looking at other countries, the United Kingdom, who has a very similar death rate as the United States, well, not very good, in fact. They're talking about doing another sort of lockdown that may extend as long as 6 months, and that's probably something the U.S. needs to do as well. But there'll be not very much public support for that, probably.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what sort of language we hear and the different framing that we hear about where we are in that pandemic. Ajay, thank you for that. And let's jump now to law professor Linda Greene. The big news of the last week, the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the move by the president to get that nominee in there to fill her seat soon before the election. And you, Dr. Greene, you're an expert in the confirmation of federal judges. How consequential is the filling of this seat to the court? I'm sorry, it looks like mute has got you again. There you go.
Sorry. You might look at this in two ways. One, how important is it to certain important precedents that the Supreme Court has decided? That's one way of looking at it. And you can also look at it in terms of the politics, the power politics of the control of a major institution of our government. I thought I'd have a few things to say about what difference Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death makes, and what it might mean for a couple of important decisions. So first of all, the Supreme Court already has a conservative majority that is the product of prior presidents. And of course, President Trump put 2 justices on the court. And so we have 5 justices on the court now nominated by a Republican president, and with Justice Ginsburg's death, 3 nominated by Democrats. So the Ginsburg replacement is going to be important in 2 areas. I'll give 2 examples. One example is in the area of abortion. And in the area of abortion, the Supreme Court did strike down a Louisiana statute just this term that required doctors who performed abortions to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. And that was a 5-4 decision. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, was a part of that majority. And therefore, the views of the particular justice who replaces Justice Ginsburg may determine a shift in the Supreme Court's support for Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court has not taken up the question whether it should overrule Roe versus Wade since 1992. At that time, they said no. But there is one justice on the court who wants Roe versus Wade overruled, and that's Justice Thomas. There's another new justice on the court, Justice Gorsuch, who, based on other comments, is not likely to support Roe versus Wade. And so there is the possibility of not only the court approving more stringent regulation of abortion, but also the possibility that the court may consider overturning Roe. So that's really important. A second area, if I could say briefly, involves the deferred action on childhood arrivals decision this year. That decision was also a 5-4 decision, with Justice Ginsburg voting in the majority. And without going into too much detail about the case, the decision of the court striking down President Trump's repudiation of Obama's policy, it was based on procedural technicalities, and therefore it is possible that the Trump administration may take another run at ending the DACA program. And again, the vote there was 5-4 with Justice Ginsburg in the majority. And here then is another example of what difference that new justice might make on this important policy. So I'll just stop there.
Good, thank you. And obviously a lot of consequence there, and that's to say nothing of the political battle that's to come on this front too. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that this hour as well.
I'm prepared to talk about how the process has changed, but please later, I'd love to talk about that as well.
Thank you so much. And I want to go next to Steve Deller. Steve, I used to hear all the time, you used to hear it's the economy, stupid, and that's what voters cared about. Is it still the economy, or is that been relegated to a back seat now?
I think AJ made a point about with COVID is that a lot of folks have already made up their mind. And I think with the economy, people have already made up their mind. And folks are, I mean, when you look at how COVID has impacted the economy, you would think that the president's approval ratings for the handling of the economy would be at all-time record lows, but they're not. And the reason is because people are looking, they're cherry picking the piece of information that supports their pre-held beliefs. For example, the stock market. As long as the stock market is doing well, people are going to be thinking that Trump is doing a good job handling the economy, despite all the evidence to the contrary. It used to be that people voted their pocketbooks, but I think that changed almost 25 years ago. There's a rather good book, I can't recall the name of the author, but it's What's the Matter with Kansas? And it essentially talked about how people shifted away from voting their own self-interest in terms of economics to more social issues. And it's, from an economist perspective, it almost seems irrational. But from a social perspective, these decisions could be perfectly rational. So I think that, you know, and with the economy right now, it is slowly starting to recover. People are becoming more comfortable with how to live with COVID. And we're not back to where we were, again, depending on the metric that you use. But people are feeling a little bit more comfortable with it. So the panic that was occurring back in April and May has pretty much passed on. So I think people are feeling a little bit more comfortable. And as a result, as long as the stock market's doing well, then the economy's doing well. At least that's the justification in their minds.
Steve, thank you for that. And you bring up the perfect point at which we can turn now to Kathy Cramer, political scientist, about the partisan divide. In fact, all of the topics we've been talking about so far are arrows pointing in one direction, and that is that we are a hyper-divided country. And Kathy, I know you're taking a look at this and also maybe how we can surmount it, but so far it seems as though we're in an era of hyper-partisanship, confirmation bias. People hear what confirms what they believe, and they may vote that way as well. How do you expect to see this playing out on the debate stage and the remainder of this election, that voters are processing what they see?
Well, they sure do process what they see through their partisan lens, and whether or not they think of themselves as a Republican or Democrat, most people lean one way currently, one way or the other. And that does work as a lens through which people will be viewing the debate, will be reading the news about or hearing the news about it the next day. But it not only sort of filters how people interpret what happens in the debate, but it is already filtering which issues they think are important. As Ajay mentioned, that among Trump supporters, COVID is not their priority issue, it's the economy. But for Biden supporters, COVID does seem to be the thing that they care most about. And I'll just point out, there was great data on this that was released this morning from our own Elections Research Center, reported in the State Journal. But it also affects how people perceive each of those issues. So political scientists have known for some time now that if your president, if your party is in control of the presidency, you're more likely to think that the economy is doing well. And so people, it's not only that they care about different issues, but they interpret those issues a different way. And so with respect to the debate, we can certainly count on people interpreting what happens Tuesday night through their own partisan lens. But that's going to play out through the rest of the election. And so you will see each candidate kind of playing to the strengths of the issue that their supporters think they're great on, and be offering up, they'll be attempting to undermine their opponent's weakness on the issue that their supporters don't think they're so great on.
Kathy, you've been studying how we can begin to really hear one another. And one way you've been doing that is by listening. You've been listening, I gather, to a lot of talk radio, both conservative and liberal talk radio. What did you hear? What are people saying?
Well, one thing that's so interesting to me is, and I've been focusing mainly on local talk radio shows and focusing in on the callers. One thing that's so interesting to me is when an issue happens, in the immediate aftermath of an issue, you see people sorting through it and sort of struggling to make sense of it, or I should say you hear people doing that, but very quickly, I mean, within a day or two, partisan divisions are already showing up. So for example, when George Floyd was murdered, in the immediate aftermath of that, I heard people on a wide variety of shows talk about how upset they were by this event and how obvious it was to them that whatever Officer Derek Chauvin had done in that case was morally reprehensible. And then they would go on to sort of make sense of it and say, but at the same time, it's not the case with all police. Or on other shows, I could hear people talk about how this is part of a pattern, this is part of a system, and it needs to be addressed. But all people, I mean, all the callers, all the hosts, it seems, were upset about the event itself. But by the next show, the next morning or the next day, people were already in their partisan camps, and it seems as though they already had their talking points. And to me, it bodes well in one case for our ability to actually find some common ground on really what we later see as very divisive issues that most people struggle with things to make sense. But unfortunately, finding common ground is going to require our leaders to show some leadership in that respect, as opposed to very quickly settling into partisan camps that are just so divisive right now.
Kathy, thank you. And Baron Kelly, I want to move to you and pick up a strand of what Kathy Cramer was just talking about there, about how after the murder of George Floyd, people were upset by that across the board before they began to process and filter it maybe into different perspectives. But part of that, I imagine, is the stories that get told. And this is something that you care a lot about, our empathy being sometimes attached to the stories that we hear. If we hear someone's perspective and we hear their story, we care. And as someone who's looked closely at this aspect of storytelling and empathy, what strikes you about where we are in the struggle for race, equity, and racial justice in this country, and how we hear, or maybe don't hear, other people's stories?
Well, first of all, I've been saying this for quite a long time, that America is a country of strangers. and you don't talk. People don't talk. And I'm speaking very generally. People don't talk to each other. And so it's very easy today to blame the other or demonize the other. And how that's been couched in this election cycle has been through the rhetoric of race. And Donald Trump understands about how to use language. He understands about how to use language to incite what he needs to incite and who he needs to incite. And he's very smart that way. His whole career has been in the front of the camera. So he sort of understands how his body comes off, how his tone comes off, how his, if you will, status comes off. Status is not just superior and inferior. There are gray areas that are in between that, but you also have to be able to listen to the other. And what Donald Trump does not do, at least what I've seen, he is operating from something the Elizabethans call the divine right of kings, where his authority is not to be challenged, not even in Congress or Parliament, really. And when he's on the stage with, and it is a stage, and when he's on the stage with Joe Biden, I think what a lot of people, he is unpredictable. People like to see what is unpredictable, you see. That's exciting to them. That famous debate where he broke protocol and walked behind Clinton. I mean, she's very composed, and she's grew up, I mean, you know, her career has been in the White House and in the halls of Congress and such like that. And Trump broke protocol. I did that myself at a conference, one of my first professional conferences, and people didn't know what I was doing. I walked amongst people talking, reading my paper, and they were going, oh my God, what is he doing? He's breaking protocol. And so, you know, Donald Trump understands this. And as far as, you know, how these talks are going to play out as far as race is concerned, I have my own concerns about things, which certainly go beyond race. And I'm going to be, and I don't know if anybody's going to touch on this, but I'm going to touch on the arts program. Money has to support the arts in this country. We have the racial issue, but we also have the arts being defunded in this country and what that means to young people. But for the most part, status and power are going to play out in this, and there are other people in this panel that can speak far more eloquently than this on this topic. In 1960, there was a famous presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. And Nixon just looked horrible. He washed out, he was perspiring for many different reasons. And Kennedy had this bronzed kind of healthy sort of composure, and he was telegenic, you know, but it was horrible. And Nixon had more experience in foreign policy than Kennedy, but we all know who won that debate, and history will say that. So this is what's going to play out here. Same thing with people watching with Donald Trump and what's going to happen with Biden, you know.
That's so interesting. Thank you for getting us into that terrain. And I want to, with that, move to Allison Prasch. And this is what you study. This is presidential rhetoric. So Barron was getting at sort of the status aspects of it, what we might see, the optics of the debate. Allison, you look at the language, and you've studied the history of this as well. And I think, as we talked about, we are in a time of crisis. This is it right now. And I think typically you might look to the leader as someone who could lift hearts and minds and move people to action. This is the time for soaring rhetoric. Are we going to see that from either Trump or Biden on the debate stage? And how do you think this the era squares up to other eras of crisis in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, and this kind of goes back to what some of my colleagues have been saying of how do you define a crisis, right? Because depending on the voters you're seeking to reach, you might call it an economic crisis or a global pandemic or a variety of different things. But I do think at this particular moment, what I will be watching for, and I think what voters and the electorate should be watching for, is how both candidates are seeking to respond to this particular crisis. So you've seen this happen in different ways throughout the campaign trail, right? The president, in some senses, you kind of diminishing the crisis in certain senses, or saying the pandemic, for example, hasn't really affected anyone, and we're over 200,000 people who have died in this country. Or you see former Vice President Joe Biden seeking to acknowledge those particular deaths and developing empathy. And you can see this in a number of situations. But I think, what the American people expect and desire, and frankly, I think we should be able to expect from a leader, is someone who is able to make sense of a crisis. Historically speaking, we think about Lincoln at Gettysburg, a pivotal moment in our nation's history, and that he is able to rise above the carnage at Gettysburg and give meaning to it and to provide a path forward. You think about FDR during the Great Depression or World War II and galvanizing the audience towards this feelings of national patriotism, and regardless of your political ideology, calling you towards a view of the country that you need to contribute as citizens. Or even, probably one of the most recent examples is, you think about President Obama and speaking in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting, right? And addressing these parents and these families at this time of national crisis. And so in all of those examples and many, many more, we expect and desire a president to be able to make sense of a crisis and also to provide as a vision for the nation going forward. And so I think then that goes kind of back to what I'm really interested to see on next Tuesday, is how are these candidates going to provide a vision for what they believe the American people are and what we can be? Because I don't think it's hyperbole to suggest that this is an incredibly important election for a number of reasons. And one of those is how we will understand ourselves. That's the role of the president from a rhetorical perspective, is how do they make sense of who we are as a country and who we will be? And I think you see differing perspectives on that. And so how they choose to communicate that and do it both through the staging, but also through their actual words. Words have consequences. Their language matters, and it can be definitional, not just in terms of who people vote for, but also the direction of the country.
I'm curious about that, because I've heard that the brain responds more to fear. So if someone talks more about things to be afraid of, will that resonate more? But what if you're a country who badly needs hope? Do you have a sense of what the American public wants to hear or needs to hear in terms of rhetoric at this moment?
Well, that's the question, right? I mean, I think that the American people are tired. They're exhausted, living through multiple crises all at the same time. And then from just a very practical local perspective, you have people who are attempting to do virtual education at home with their children while holding full-time jobs, right? And that's just one example. And so I do think, though, unfortunately, over the last 4 years, that citizenry has become kind of immune in a sense to hearing these fear appeals and this divisive language, and perhaps expecting that this is the only way that presidents speak. When I teach my students in the class on the election this semester, we talk about how historically people have responded to crises, or even in times of division. And I think that it does take a moral political leader who's able to rise above that, to acknowledge the fear, that there are real things to be afraid for, but also to provide that vision and that hope. And I think it may take the electorate a while to recognize why that's significant and important. But I also do think that should be a galvanizing force in the debates. And if a candidate is able to do that and kind of help people rise out of their exhaustion and their fear, that can be a really powerful motivator.
Allison, thank you for that. And let's do another lightning round. Get everyone in quickly on a question from a viewer right now. We have the question: in an era of extreme partisan polarization, what role do presidential debates play in the election? And I'll boil that down further. Do debates still matter? Do they matter right now? Is this one going to matter? And I'm just going to go in order of your swears on my computer. Steve Deller, let's go to you first. do debates still matter? Is this one going to have a place?
I think that you can lose a debate, and I think you can lose a debate by basically stumbling, making fundamental mistakes, and coming across, again, as being uncivil. I don't think it's possible to win a debate anymore because people have made up their mind, but it's possible to lose one if you really perform very poorly. For example, in President Obama's re-election campaign, his first debate, he did not take it seriously, and it really showed, and it shocked a lot of people. But today, I think that people kind of, when Barron was talking, about the way that President Trump kind of owns the stage and whatnot, what I noted to myself is almost like a shock jock, is that he kind of enjoys kind of sparking reactions. And I think his base really appreciates that, whereas the folks that are leaning towards Biden kind of find that maybe offensive is the wrong word, but that's part of the polarization. And I think the only way that the debate will matter now is if one of them performs very, very poorly.
Interesting, Steve. You can lose it, but you can't win it. Let's go next to Ajay. What do you think? Do debates matter?
I think the debates will matter, at least for 24 hours or maybe 48 hours. And then, after multiple debates, a trend will sort of be established as to how people feel overall candidates have performed. I think it also depends on what topics are covered and if they're the topics that resonate with the voter watching the debate. There is a wide range in sort of what people want to see in the debate covered, and that's going to establish whether somebody thinks a candidate won or lost, or if it went well.
Great, thank you for that. Linda, you're up. What do you think about this? Do debates matter?
Well, according to recent polling, only 3% of the American people have yet to make their mind up about this election. And number two, of course, voting has already begun. And so in some sense, I think that the debates will matter less. I do agree that it's possible for a candidate to stumble. I think the risk, it may be that President Trump, playing into a strong man persona, may overstep on some question of great sensitivity. That's a possibility. And President Biden, as empathetic as he is likely to be about some issues, may not be able, for example, to forcefully articulate his commitment to racial justice. These are, again, there are a number of other issues, but given what we are experiencing today, I think that for President Trump, overplaying or dismissing concerns that the American people as a whole believe are legitimate. The statistics show that there's a great increase in the number of whites who believe that police brutality against Blacks is a national problem. So there's the possibility that he might overplay his law and order position in this debate. But there's also the possibility that Biden may not be able to summon a passionate and forceful commitment to racial justice, including an end to police violence. And I see those as two possible ways that the two candidates might stumble.
Wonderful. Those are really wonderful points there to consider. And I think maybe it was you used the word authenticity before. And if we are hearing from candidates language about, for instance, racial justice, how does that resonate? Does it resonate with authenticity or does it not? Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Dr. Greene. And let's move to Allison Prasch next. Allison, do debates still matter? Is this one going to be consequential?
Well, I'm a scholar of language, so I have to say yes, right? But I absolutely do believe that the debates still matter. And I think, context matters. And in this particular context, what I would say is if you think about previous debates that you've watched, and I imagine this will happen next week, often the questions can be hypothetical, right? What would you do in this particular scenario if X were to happen? And I actually did a search this morning of in the 2016 presidential debates, was there a question about a global pandemic? And there was not. But but we are living through multiple hypotheticals, right? It is not difficult for the US electorate to imagine particular crises, and there are a number of them. And so one way you might think about presidential debates is that it is a audition, as Barron was talking about, on a stage, on a national stage that millions of Americans are watching. Now, I do sympathize with the point that many people have already made up their minds, that it is a highly polarized electorate, but I do think having a moment to have two candidates standing, well, hopefully more than 6 feet apart, but on a stage answering these questions. And I hope that the questions will ask them to directly address how will you deal with the current non-hypothetical that we are living through right now. And that those answers, I think, are going to be very telling. Now, if they answer them directly, or if they try to, deflect attention or obfuscate or whatever it is, but they are going to be forced to deal with that particular question.
Allison, thank you for that. And let's go next to Barron. Barron, on the question, do debates still matter? What would you say?
Most people I know are probably, if they're going to watch, they're going to watch because it's going to be theater. And they're going to want to see Donald Trump coming out of the corner, swinging. They're going to want to see what he's going to do. As again, he's unpredictable. Even his staff has tried to get him to stay to the script. And when he starts to get riled up, I don't know if there's going to be some kind of a reciprocal or a negotiation of an exchange. And I think people want to see this. And it's, it's theater. And the unpredictable is really exciting to watch instead of the composed sort of, you stay in your lane, you stay in your default self, and you just go along. I don't know if, as I've heard, I don't know if Biden is going to be able to have that kind of energy if Trump gets riled up and he's going to start to go on the attack in some sort of way. And that's what people are excited about. I just have to say one thing. Listen, I lived in California for a number of years, and Schwarzenegger was elected the governor, and most people didn't know anything about politics. They said, oh, the Terminator. Yeah, we're going to get him. And then Ronnie Reagan before him, for God's sake, a B-movie actor. But the thing about Reagan was he was a great communicator. I'll give that to him. He was a great communicator. So I think they matter as much as the debate. This debate is going to matter as much as any kind of entertainment is going to matter, to tell you the truth.
So Barron, debate is theater. Very quickly, is it Shakespeare or is it improv?
Well, again, with Donald Trump, it's going to be improv. And he's good at that. He's good at that.
All right, thank you, Barron. And Kathy, we'll move to you. Debates. You're a political scientist. I think you will think like Allison that they matter very much. But what do you have to say about that question?
Well, I think this year in particular, partly because of the pandemic, there's been fewer campaign events. And so the entertainment value is going to be huge. But I think it's especially important for the thing that many of you have mentioned, which is this sort of excitement, motivation factor. So many people have already made up their mind, as Linda said. But the issue now is who's going to show up to vote, who's going to request their absentee ballot, or who's going to show up on election day. And if either of the candidates really messes up, it might turn off people. If the candidates excite people, that could matter. Now, it might matter more in the remaining two debates in October, closer to election day. But as Linda said, lots of people are voting already. So I think this will matter, just how excited people get about their candidate.
And Kathy, I'm going to stay with you for another question, this one from someone who's watching online, and they'd like to know how different, and this is probably the million-dollar question, but I'd like to know what you're thinking. How different will Wisconsin vote this year compared to 2016?
Oh, you and the rest of the world. Yeah, I mean, you and the rest of the world wants to know that. It is the key question. I mean, there's so much attention on Wisconsin. Right now, it looks like, according to polling, it looks like Trump has a little bit more of a challenge here. And I think that the big factor is his opponent. Hillary Clinton was super unpopular with lots of people last time around. And Biden doesn't quite carry the baggage that she did, whether it was frankly because she was a woman or because she carried the Clinton brand. And so I think Wisconsin is a little bit more of a challenge for Trump this time around. But that is the key question for sure.
So you've got Wisconsin, and it seems almost as though Wisconsin is the swingiest of the swing states this time around. But what are your senses about some of the others? Michigan, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, that poll I mentioned earlier that just came out from the Elections Research Center was a poll of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And it looks like, it's just on the borderline of the margin of error of the polling, but that Biden is ahead in those three states. But it's close in all three states, super close. A lot can happen in this last month or so. So I wish I had the crystal ball, but I don't.
We'll wait and see. That one's one everyone is watching. Thank you, Kathy. And Ajay, I want to go back to you for a moment to talk about another factor at play, and that is misinformation campaigns. Misinformation and conspiracy theories have been rife in the last year or two, and I wonder what you think the impact has been on trust and on the way that we digest news and wisdom, I guess, about our public health.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of forces at play here, and it's definitely a time of fear and uncertainty, and that's fueling sort of the spread of misinformation and sort of the belief in conspiracies when one comes across them. I think, there's also active disinformation campaigns, and I think that also becomes something to address. They're outside actors. We sometimes think of disinformation campaigns coming from foreign governments, but there's also many disinformation campaigns right here in the United States. And, I thought it was interesting that Tony Fauci's sort of public affairs specialist turned out to be somebody who for years has been disparaging him and the COVID response. So, I think it's definitely a problem, and it's been occurring long before COVID, but COVID has just simply amplified all of that. I think the best way to address that is really to recognize it's happening and to have people really take it seriously, because it's a real problem.
Have we seen that erosion of trust? I'm thinking about maybe the last 5-10 years, we've seen entities like Pew reporting erosion in trust in organized religion, in government. And I wonder if we're seeing that now more with that erosion happening in the scientific community with scientific entities. Are you seeing that so far?
Well, historically, like an agency like the CDC has been the most trusted among federal agencies. But during this pandemic, the CDC, there's a lot of views that perhaps the CDC is sort of compromised a little bit and giving in a little bit to political pressure. So some of that trust is eroding. And there's also partisan divide there as far as trust in the government to effectively, respond to a pandemic, where a lot of Republicans will state that the government right now is doing just fine. And it perhaps is because their perceived sort of threat of the pandemic is not as high, while Democrats, very few, think that the government is doing a good job right now. There is an erosion of trust, and it varies greatly by how you plan to vote.
Ajay, thank you for that. And I want to go back to Linda and talk a little more about race and racial justice. There's so much, Linda, that we could talk with you about. The Supreme Court is one, but I know in particular we want to get into this issue as well. And could you talk us through a little bit about some of the motion that you've seen in one area of your specialty, which is sports and race, sort of this intersection here? We've seen national sports franchises come under the banner a little bit of the Black Lives Matter movement, the racial justice movement. Are things like that, do you think, going to swing the needle at all on the movement that we're seeing? I think your mute is still on. There we go. Thank you. Nope. Still there. Linda, I think your mute button is still on.
I got it off. Am I okay now?
You're perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I would say I do not think that the sports involvement alone, with just the final embrace of Colin Kaepernick's very public concerns, for which he paid a very high price, I don't think sports alone will be enough. But when we think about major sports figures like LeBron James, for example, actually focusing the attention of America on racialized policing, what we're talking about is a conversation that not only reaches the public broadly, that is, people on all sides, as we used to say, of the aisle, love football. Not only does it reach the public more broadly, but it reaches into the boardrooms of the most powerful companies in the world who are very invested in sports, the media, for example, the sports franchises, etc. And so it's that their involvement takes a conversation to different places than it might ordinarily occur. And I think that's really the significance of the involvement of sports figures. There's legislation pending in Congress, the George Floyd Racial Justice and Policing Act. There are policy changes that various legislators are considering. But when you have celebrities involved in focusing on social justice issues, you get a different kind of leverage. They can not only motivate a broad range of people, but they also have the ear of the most powerful. And when you threaten to shut down a season of sport or even a day, that means that those owners now have a stake in ensuring that their players are safe. We've had incidents in Milwaukee where NBA Bucks basketball player was pulled over and tased. And so this is not abstract. Many of these is certainly in basketball, in football, the majority of these teams are Black men. And so the threat that they feel is palpable, but they have a great ability to energize their teammates and really cause the conversation to be heard at different levels and in different places. And that's what I think is the importance of their involvement.
Thank you so much for that, Linda. And I want to bring in a question we had for Baron. We were talking, and if other folks want to chime in on this too, by all means chime in, but I'd like to start with Baron and Allison. And some of this may have been answered offline, but I think everyone will be interested to know. Baron, you were talking a lot about the theater of debate and how Trump has this sort of improvisatory feel, which I think you think is compelling to watch. But the listener wants to know, what about Biden? What can he do to, I guess, counter that? And if you were coaching, the two of you, Allison and Baron, Joe Biden, for his time debating Donald Trump, what would you tell him? And Baron, I know you've done Shakespeare, you've done Broadway, you've been on television. What's your top piece of advice here?
Well, first of all, if I was coaching Joe Biden, I know he's an older man, but I would get his energy level up. I would get his voice up. I would get his energy level up. He's got to come in with a sense of engagement that is connected into what he's facing, and he's got to be able to listen and respond with that kind of reciprocal energy if he's faced with that, instead of laying back and not stepping forward. Do you know what I mean? So that the energy is moving forward. His energy is a little bit, complacent and laid back. He's made gaffes in his career, but this is a little different this time. So he's going to be up against somebody that has that improvisational nature.
So bring that energy up. And Allison, how about you? We've got energy up from Baron. What advice would you give, maybe from a rhetorical perspective, on a speech that really, presentation that soars?
Yeah, so I would say, in addition to the energy, because I absolutely agree, I think I would tell the Biden campaign that they really need to prepare him to address very specifically how and why he is distinct from Trump. Because I think one of the issues is, yes, political theater may be interesting to watch, but what does that give ordinary citizens in their everyday lives who are encountering multiple crises? right? And so not only does Biden need to demonstrate that he's energetic and able to has the willpower and the stamina to lead a country in the midst of crisis, but he also needs to articulate, in some sense, say to the audience without saying it directly, is this what you want to be solving these crises, or do you want someone who is going to lead in these particular ways? Because if Trump is only relying on that stagecraft, it may be interesting to watch, but to some people in the electorate, it may seem that that's not good enough. And I think Biden has to articulate that in a way that's pretty savvy and nuanced, but that would be my suggestion.
Allison, thanks a lot for that. And let's get the political scientists on this. Kathy, these two candidates, they may or may not be matched in energy or performance, but in terms of what you're hoping to see from that political communication, this is what you do. You study, among other things, political communication. What do they need to do to communicate clearly and emphatically and really address, a nation in crisis right now?
Well, I think just kind of basic debate 101 would be, you have to try to steer the conversation to your strengths as quickly as possible. And their strengths are pretty different. So I guess we'll just see how good each of them is at kind of maneuvering, just switching, going from the stated question to what it is that they want to talk about. And yes. And that brings up for me that I'm really curious about how the moderator is going to behave, because there's so much intensity around this election, and these are two fighters of candidates. I mean, maybe all presidential candidates are, but I don't expect Joe Biden to just sort of be mild. He's, we may be talking about his energy level, but we've also seen him on the national stage kind of be pretty feisty, right? So how well is the moderator going to be able to handle these two? They're a handful. So that's not necessarily political science, but it's just, as a member of the electorate, I'm super curious about how these two are going to behave, if they are at all.
Right, I guess that's a big question too. And we are, all of us right now in Wisconsin. I want to go to you, Steve. Our unique vantage point here in Wisconsin, which the world is watching right now. There's tons of attention right now on our state. From that economy perspective, you're sitting in Wisconsin. Maybe you're in a small town, maybe you're not so sure about the future of your job. What do you want to hear on the debate stage to resonate right now with what you and your family are going through?
I think it is what's driving a lot of the recovery right now is confidence. And confidence hinges on how much uncertainty there is floating around right now. And I think that as we, when COVID first hit, people didn't know what was going on. So they couldn't really make a risk assessment, if you will. So everybody just shut down. And as people became more comfortable, that uncertainty went away. And as they become more comfortable, the economy is going to start to rebound. Now, from that kind of perspective, you would think that the kind of leaps and stops and forward surges that President Trump has with his economic policies, that it would be driving a lot of uncertainty, because we don't know what are we going to do with China? What are we going to do with Europe in terms of trade? But that doesn't appear to be affecting a large part of the electorate. They basically put their trust in him and said he knows what he's doing. He's a successful businessman. We could argue that whether he is or isn't, but that's the perception. So I think a lot of it is, how uncertain are there is happening right now in the economy. And what is happening right now is not what the economics would predict. The economics would be saying that it's time for a change, but that doesn't appear to be what 40% of the population is saying. But the outlook from the economic perspective is looking better and better, but it varies significantly across the state. For example, if you look at Wisconsin in terms of the job recovery from the fall. High wage jobs, we're back up above where we were. Medium wage jobs, we're about where we were. But low wage jobs, we're not anywhere close to where we were. Across the state, it varies. You look at, for example, Ashland County, a fairly rural county. It has 28% more jobs now than it did before the panic. Okay, but La Crosse County is actually 24% fewer jobs than before the panic. There's no pattern here. It's kind of a, I mean, when you dig into it deeper, you can say, well, La Crosse is because of all the hospitals, but there's no set pattern here. So we're almost in uncharted territory. It's really hard to kind of predict what's going to happen because all the traditional norms have broken down. So what was
there, Steve? We're out of time. You get the last word, but thank you to all of you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. It was a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful leadership.
Thank you for watching at home on your computer, streaming this today. If you want to rewatch it or share a link, it will be available in 2 or 3 days at discovery.wisc.edu, and you can check online for more. Thank you for watching. This was the Crossroads of Ideas.